For 25 years, they've got data from 1990 to 2015. 67% of the line of duty deaths there have been due to cancer. That's a good amount of data to support that. This was put out by, and this is actually the top part. I don't have anything to give away today. I usually try to bring prizes and gifts to give away, but I don't think I have anything. Do I have anything with me today? No, I don't. Can anybody look at this top corner and tell me what the problem is? This is actually what was published by Representative Rich Hanna when they were trying to get the Firefighter Cancer Registry Act published. There's a major issue in this top right square because it's incorrect in what it says. And everybody read that and tell me what they think the problem with that is. So it says 3 out of 5 career firefighters are estimated to die from cancer, period. I mean, 60% of you in the room are going to die from cancer. That's not what the data says. The data says that 60% of line of duty deaths are going to be due to the cancer right now, okay? Doesn't mean 60% of all firefighters are going to die from cancer. And that's what this actually says. And that's a little bit of a misnomer. Do we really know the number? Absolutely not. But we know that this number was mistaken for the 60% line of duty deaths that we had the information on. So just be aware, sometimes the information out there is not transmitted properly through the media and through politicians. So just be aware of do your own research, ask questions. I have business cards. Feel free to give me a call and I can always try to find the answer if you have any issues. But be aware of where we really are at it, and we don't exactly know what our current rate is. Could it be 2 out of 10? Absolutely. Could it be more? Yeah. Could it be a little less? Possibly too. I mean, we just don't have that, so it makes it a little bit hard to say that. So that's definitely not right, I'll tell you that, because I know that number is based on the 60% line of duty deaths, which is, again, nothing to do with 60% of all firefighters. So people often ask me about big fires, GE, Whiskey Row, these big fires that, are once a generation fire, these big commercial fires. And a lot of people get caught up in the big fires and talk about, I heard the chief of Boston say this at a meeting. He's like, Commissioner Finn said, I had 6 guys that made this transformer fire, again, they're men and women, that made this transformer fire, and they all died within a year of each other of cancer. And it was thing about transformer. It was transformers like on the power lines. They're filled with very corrosive carcinogenic oil that protects them and insulates them. And he's like, I know that fire is what gave them cancer. That is something we cannot do. And I want to make that clear. And I know the state of Indiana, I think the presumption law in the state of Indiana asks you guys, who knows the presumption law in Indiana pretty well? Anybody? Learn it quick and make sure you understand it, because I believe it asks you to tell them exactly which fire you got cancer in. That is ridiculous, because there's no scientific or medical way to tell what gave you cancer specifically, what specific fire. It's a cumulative, long-term, repeated exposure to carcinogens that drives this. It's not a single event that's causing it, okay? So I don't like to focus on single events, because then people get this in their mind. We only have to worry about the big fires, or the fires that contain this or that. The ordinary Class A combustible fires, we're probably completely fine with, okay? That's not something we want to focus on. We want to focus on everything exactly the same. We want to do that from start to finish, just like we normally do all of our, we treat all runs the same. We prepare the same, and then once we get on scene, we find out what we have, and we change plans as needed and address. And that's exactly what we want to do when we're dealing with all fires, is that this is our bread and butter, let's be honest. This is what we make 99% of the time, car fires, dumpster fires, trailer fires, single room content fires, and we make these over and over, and these are our chronic exposures. Does that mean a GE is not a very large exposure? No, it doesn't mean that. It just means that I can't point to it, and neither can anyone else in the scientific community or in the medical community, and say, GE gave you cancer, because it's just not possible. And if they say that, I don't know what they're basing that on, because there's not any scientific method to do that. So what we do and what presumption laws should do is provide the presumption that if you're a firefighter and you have all these repeated exposures throughout your career, that is what the presumption then is, that it's presumed if you get cancer, and it's one of the cancers that are listed, it's due to your occupational exposure. That's why it's called a presumption law. So when they say that you have to clearly say what fire you got the cancer in, to me that's not a presumption law, that's a specific cancer law. Tell me which fire gave you cancer and then we'll make sure you get covered. I don't know how to address that. I would, like I said, I've just went through, I'm working with Supporting Heroes on the side to help them come up with some cancer work because they cover Indiana, they cover Missouri, they cover Kentucky. We're trying to come up with some common ground for all the states to provide a cancer program for them, because it's really hard when all the states they deal with have completely different laws. So my brain is full right now of Ohio, Indiana, Kentucky, which I do know pretty hands down, Missouri, Tennessee, and West Virginia's presumption laws. Okay, so I can't exactly tell you what the state of Indiana says. I know that I believe when I read it, it was not extremely clear. And like I said, I have a PhD and it wasn't very clear to me. It does classify back to type 1 and 2 carcinogens and 2A carcinogens. So it's a little vague specifically in what types of carcinogens, because that's an extremely large list of different types of toxins. Now, I don't remember seeing a portion about it specifying that, but definitely know your presumption law. And if you have problems, feel free to contact your legislators. They're the ones that wrote it, so they better be able to explain it to you. And if they don't, they've got a problem, because they signed off and agreed on something, especially if they voted yes for it, they signed off on something that they can't explain to you. The unions have a lot of power towards that. So the hope for a lot of these presumption laws we got was that this was just a start, okay, right? These were just beginning. We were just getting our foot in the door, and then we were going to expand. Same thing with Kentucky. We have 12 cancers on the list. Esophageal is not on the list. Pancreatic cancer is not on the list. Lung cancer is not on the list in the state of Kentucky. These are things we know that are on other cancer lists that show that there are increases of. The idea is we'll start with these 12 and we'll eventually add to those, okay? So just make sure you work with your union representatives, work with your local people, and try to make sure that it's clear what needs to be done, because there are some things that can eliminate you from coverage and things that can basically prevent you from getting any type of coverage from that. In Kentucky, for instance, you cannot have smoked in 10 years, use any tobacco product in 10 years in the state of Kentucky. If you have, including dip or vaping, you're completely exempt from the law. It means you're not covered. You have to be a firefighter for 5 consecutive years. You have to be less than the age of 65 when you die, meaning my father-in-law, who got prostate cancer and bladder cancer, if he would have died from either one of those over the age, because he was over the age of 65 at that time, would have not been covered. So you got to know the laws and the ins and outs, and then that gives you a baseline from then to advocate for yourselves and for other firefighters to get the types of changes we need to get made. Sorry, that's my little soapbox about that. Probably everybody has seen this video, minus 1 or 2 people in the room. We usually show this video for 2 reasons. We usually show this for fire behavior and flash over. It's a fantastic video put out by Underwriters Laboratory. It shows basically a legacy room and a modern room. So this legacy room has legacy furniture, solid wood, natural fibers, 50s style stuff. The modern room has your, let's go to anywhere from IKEA to Walmart to buy furniture. It's all synthetics and compressed particle board with veneers and stuff like that. The big thing that this shows, of course, we teach it for fire behavior because we show the difference between the way fires used to behave and how fires behave now and the speed at which fires move. We're looking now, a standard flashover time for modern single room is about 3.5 minutes. In the good old days, they had 29 minutes plus to get there and get it before it flashes. So for most of us, by the time we get to the call and get to the building, at least one room is probably flashed and we're going into a second room. The other reason I bring this up is because a lot of this has to do with synthetics, because synthetics, when they off-gas, release a lot of flammable gases that burn hot, produce a lot more heat, burn a lot faster, And that's what's driving this flashover to be so much higher, okay? I know there's been discussion before, people said, oh, it's because houses are built so much tighter now than they used to be, and then they sealed in, and that's why. Trust me, houses are built a lot worse than they used to be built. If you ever go out with you guys have a inspector that you ever go out and do inspections and building inspections, the houses are not being built as well as they previously were. So that's not that. The big issue we're facing is that the materials in the buildings are burning, they're producing a lot more combustible gases, and they're just growing really insipidly faster. In the old days, like I said, they would get there. Often the fire would still be in that incipient stage. It was easy knockdown, low levels of smoke. Now we're getting there. We have a fully involved room spreading to a second room. We got a call. I'll give an example. We got a call on a fatality, and I think I mentioned this already, apartment, and we had 2 fires that day. And the first one we made was an apartment fire with a rescue, and it was a second floor wheelchair-bound person, no elevator. So I don't know. I think he had someone carrying him to the second floor. Should have never been in the second floor. We get up there. It's gone through one room. It's made its way. I could see it as soon as we pulled out of the firehouse. We turned left out of the firehouse. I was in the rear jump seat, and I said, it's a worker. I can see it from here. Radio calls back, and it's like 10:30 in the morning. And they said, we've got multiple calls, which you always know when you hear that is definitely a worker. The police got there and said, yeah, so we knew it was working. We get there, and literally the guy said, when I called, it was barely just a little fire, and from that amount of time, he said, 3-4 minutes, it went from that to that whole apartment to the one above it, and so it spreads really quickly. The heat, immense, things like that. So that's kind of one of the things that drives some other dangers that we face in the fire service. So not all this is just strictly to do with fire behavior and flashover. Some of this actually also has to do with the types of materials we're facing. To the point that even New York Magazine put out an article about how modern furniture endangers firefighters because the increasing use of synthetics and synthetic covering and coatings on furniture is producing a lot of carcinogens that are driving cancer rate among first responders. And this is a magazine that has nothing to do with the fire service at all. It's just a New Yorker magazine that puts out articles. This was in their health section over 3 years ago. This was put on September 11th. They usually do a firefighter story on September 11th, but this year that they did one specifically looking at the cancer rate. All right, this is a really cool video I like to show and then I'll let you guys take another break because discussing the contamination in the truck and discussing going to a fire scene and doing all of our normal stuff and then coming back to the firehouse, we never think about what we transmit around the firehouse and how those carcinogens that get on us are then transferred around the entire firehouse from place to place. Sometimes we take them home, especially if you wear your station gear home after a fire, you're taking some of that stuff home with you. And it kills me because I used to think I'd wash my station gear with my son's clothes and my wife's clothes in the washing machine and never thought anything about it. It's one of those things, but this is a really ingenious way they did this. They used the dye that they put in money bags from banks. It's an invisible dye that explodes and pretty much coats whoever the bank robber or whoever it is when they open it up, and then they have an easy way of detecting who stole the money. And they basically put this on firefighters, let them take their gear off, and then go back to their regular duties during the day, and they follow them around the firehouse and show all the places that they go and how much contamination is there. I'm gonna make it big.
So this is super invisible powder that's used actually for theft detection and cash, but one of the things we're trying to simulate is pretending that this is lime soot, just the same type of soot that comes off combustible and burning materials you would encounter in a fire incident response. The initiative actually came to us from the Palm Beach County Fire Rescue Department. They were very interested in understanding about how what they did for work was impacting their health, specifically how maybe being a firefighter or an EMS responder may increase their risk for cancer. One of the things we were trying to do today is figure out, is there a way we can demonstrate how maybe cancerous materials are transferred from a fire incident response back to the fire station and personal vehicle. And so today was really a teaching exercise and a scientific exercise of trying to see how we demonstrate where soot, represented by this invisible dye, might be transferring from when they go to respond to a fire and come back to the fire station. So the goal today was trying to be able to identify, can we feasibly show how soot is transferred from a fire incident response back to their truck and back to the fire station. Start going through the different scenarios of post-decon into the fire engine, back into the bunk, into the restrooms, back here to the coffee table, it starts becoming less visible to the naked eye. But that powder that is invisible over chronic exposure could be potentially causing cellular changes that we just don't know about yet. And hopefully through some of our studies we can start identifying those changes. An eye-opening experience for us because I anticipated, some demonstration of how much dye would transfer. I didn't realize the breadth and scope of how much dye would spread within the different scenarios that we were shooting in, as well as continue to transfer on after the first fire engine truck. So for me, it was very impressive to see even some of the invisible dye transfer onto the bunks where they're sleeping at night. Even if it's a smaller quantity, you could imagine that low-dose chronic exposure of this dye might be potentially increasing their risk over time. We filmed today in the EMS's personal vehicle. You could easily see even fainter wisps of plume of dye on the ceiling as well as on the seat that were not direct contacts but were physically visible on it, suggesting that the particulate moves around. So you might not visibly see soot, and in this case we got to see a dye, but that could potentially be increasing your cancer risk. The firefighter works as a fomite and is transferring, carcinogen from where their place of work back to their personal home. So we had an opportunity to have a child with us today to be able to demonstrate maybe what happens in passing some of that soot using a soccer ball. So we were able to have a child play with one of the EMS firefighters with that soccer ball. And we were able to see second-degree transfer of this invisible dye, i.e. the soot, transfer from the EMS to the soccer ball and to the child. One of the activities that I hope arises from this video that we're producing is that firefighters are a little bit more cognizant about how hygiene is a very important aspect, and decontamination is an important aspect of post-incident fire response, because it makes them a little bit more aware of not only of the soot that they bring back into the fire station, but also what they might be taking to their personal homes and sharing with their families through secondary and tertiary contact of this soot on their own person. And I hope that the firefighters see that as a way of creating an opportunity for awareness and how we improve hygiene and decontamination within the fire service.
All right, I think we'll rock on through to lunchtime so we get you guys done by noon. If anyone has to use the restroom, feel free to jump up and take off, get a drink of water, whatever you need to do. That way I can make sure you got it, because trust me, I don't want anybody missing a meal. This one never likes closing out. Unless you get a run, of course.
District 1, prepare on down, West Maple and Mulberry. Beginning Region 41, District 1, prepare on down, West Maple and Mulberry, down 1106.
All right. So how do we limit risk? So we already talked about exhaust capture systems. That's one thing that they're pushing. Expensive as can be. Potential protection, probably kind of small. Second thing is that they require human intervention, which they often fail. Trust me, I've been to many, many firehouses that have these, and guess what? They're just hanging there and not hooked onto the fire truck. It's not, you can't take away the human element from that. I lapped in for last year when at Christmas time we have a thing where a lot of us will cover for other departments for like Christmas parties and stuff like that, and we were covering the duty shift, got to go to the Christmas party for PRP, and we were covering for them. We were one of the trucks that were covering for them, and they have the Plimo vent system hooked up. I pull out of the station and guess what I do? I rip that thing completely out of the ceiling because it doesn't come off ours. And the guy's like, "Oh, it's because you don't have the right adapter on your exhaust." And I'm like, "Nobody told me that. They just said to hook it up when I got into the firehouse." But so then I managed to spend the next hour trying to put it back together on the ceiling, and luckily they're actually apparently meant to break free like that and be put back together. They're really expensive. They can be plumbed entirely wrong, meaning that all the exhaust can go outside, and then as soon as you open up that bay door, it all comes right back in. So they're only as good as well as they're designed. The cost is really insurmountable for a lot of departments. Not the biggest bang for your buck, I'm going to tell you that right now. And I'll tell you what I think is the biggest bang for the buck in the fire service right now, where we get the most protection for the best money we can spend. Let's talk about some personal habits. We've not identified everything that can cause cancer, but we do know some things that can cause genetic mutations and lead to cancer. So as we age, as we get older, our chances of getting cancer increase. That's one reason why some presumption laws have cutoffs for like 70 years old, 65 years old, because if you do live long enough, eventually your chances of cancer precipitously increase every year. Okay. Genetics, something you can't get past. You can definitely blame your parents for this. So be careful. Your kids could blame you for this. On top of, you talked about they got your good-looking gene. They may have, they could also give them a bad gene too. Exactly. So the genetics, specifically one that we see a lot of is BRCA1, which is a breast cancer mutation we see in women. We're starting to find more and more genetic mutations associated with different types of cancers. And that's just one of the things that we have to pay attention to and go from there. Use of tobacco products, they're pretty much pushing for a complete stop use of all tobacco products. That's from smoking cigarettes, that's from dipping and vaping. And the reason why is because the vaping, they're like, well, vaping tends to be a fallback for people who smoke, and they tend to fall back to smoking. So we already have so many carcinogens that we don't want to be adding anything extra to our body. Alcohol consumption, excessive, because we talked earlier about hepatocellular carcinoma. Viruses can actually induce cancer. If you have kids in the age of 10 to 13, the Gardasil vaccine I suggest for boys and girls get this. It will probably reduce cervical cancer to about 90 to 95% of the cases are related to HPV, so it'll probably knock those down in the next couple generations to really low levels. It won't necessarily eliminate the ones we're seeing in the fire service, but it will at least knock down potentially other ones as well. Dietary choices. Firefighters are the most interesting group I've ever dealt with, because every station I go to, I come across people that have different diets and different workout plans, and I probably ask about every diet that's out there. My best advice, which is advice that most physicians will give you, is eat a well-balanced, healthy diet. If you're going to eat meat, that's fine, but balance it with lots of fresh fruits and vegetables. Just be cognizant of that. Definitely, because we have so many carcinogens already, you want to stay away from things that would add a lot of grilled food. Often when you blacken the meat, that actually is a part of a carcinogen. We eat that it can increase our chances. Eat things high in fiber as well, which is very good for our colon. Helps keep colon health well as far as that too, because everything we eat goes through our entire digestive system. Sunscreen, because we already have such a high exposure to cancer. Skin cancer, we want to make sure that we address that by using sunscreen as much as possible. Like I mentioned, my friend who's had skin cancer several times, and she's only in her 30s. So there is some work going on. Sarah Janke and Jeff Burgess did this, and this is just preliminary work. This has not been published yet, but they're nice enough to share this for me and give this to me to use in my class. They're doing a study right now on female firefighters breastfeeding, okay, after birth. So the thing they found is that they've taken breast milk. They had 2 cohorts of firefighters that were breastfeeding, that were providing milk samples to them, and they were measuring. And about 72 hours after the firefighters were being exposed to smoke, the levels of carcinogens in the breast milk are still present. The first thing they did, even before they've completed this research, is they suggested that you go basically 72 hours and you pump and dump for that entire period. You don't breastfeed during that period. I will tell you that a lot of my friends that have basically decided either just to go to formula or they've taken leaves from work to do that. And that's tough decisions I don't think we should have to make in the fire service. And hopefully some of the mitigation things we can do can decrease that from having to be something we have to worry about. But there is ongoing research specifically driven towards female firefighters. I just wanted you to make you aware of that. Our culture has changed. The ideas of dirty gear being a badge of honor are gone, I think. I don't think anybody's kind of on that train anymore. Restriction of fire gear to the bay and to the apparatus is pretty common now. We're not taking it into offices. We're not taking it into our bunk areas and places like that. We're keeping it in one area only, which is what we want to do. These were the badge of honor. These photos are what commonly we saw. I mean, I have these photos, like again, everything we talk about today, I'm guilty of, so don't feel like I'm picking on anyone here because I've done every one of these things incorrectly. Luckily, I don't think anybody will recognize any of these people because I randomly just pulled these off the internet and did not use anybody I know because I didn't want anybody to feel like I was picking on them. But we all have these types of photos. If you've been a firefighter for any amount of time, you have those photos because it was a badge of honor. Now that we know that it's no longer a badge of honor, it's a badge of danger, we have to change kind of the way we're addressing that. So, talk about gear and apparatus. We already discussed that, about how we contaminate things by moving in and out of the fire apparatus. And our gear is basically, spreading that as like a fomite, and we're spreading that everywhere we go. One of the things that people suggest is you do apparatus decon on a weekly basis after a fire or whatever. You wipe down all the hard surfaces in your fire truck with whatever you want. You can use Dawn diluted 1 to 10 in water. You can use whatever type of cleaner you like that the smell doesn't bother everybody on the crew. But the idea is for all these hard surfaces to get clean. This was an example of one of our newer engines we use. We do it every 2 weeks, and this is all the stuff that came off just between 2 weeks. The more difficult things we face are like the seats. The seats are highly absorbent, especially the 911 and the rescue style seats like that. There's not a method to really clean those seats. I've heard Phoenix is one of the departments that does steam cleaning of all their seats in their fire engines, and they say black stuff just pours out of them because they absorb everything as you're setting on them. They absorbs all that stuff. I don't know if that, it might be something where you might want to get one of the local companies that do this to come in and try and say, hey, would you be willing to just come in and do this on one of our fire trucks so we can film what's coming out of these seats? And that might, you might end up getting steam cleaners for the firehouse and doing it for, so often on the trucks to decrease that exposure, because that's where all that carcinogen is lying in wait, is in there. And if we can pull that out, that's beneficial. If you have air conditions in your trucks as well, make sure you're changing those cabin filters. Another thing in Phoenix that was told to me is that the current chief of Phoenix, she said when she was a captain that one day they came to her and they said, Captain, the truck still, 2 weeks after that fire, it still smells like smoke inside. And she said, have you guys cleaned the truck? Yeah, we cleaned the inside of the apparatus. She said, have you messed with the air conditioner? And they're like, what are you talking about? She said, the air filter in the air conditioner, have you changed that? And they're like, no. And they go in there and they pull it out in solid black, just because it's circulating all that air. Pull that out, throw a new one in. They're not that expensive, but those are things you have to think about that we never thought about before. Other parts of our gear. I know that some of the new gear, the new Scott stuff, is going to have removable straps. Some of the new MSA stuff will too, and they'll be completely washable. We have some of the older Scott packs like these with the face regulated, so it shows me my status here. This is exactly basically what we use. The straps do not come off. There's not a great way to clean those and decon those. Those are exposed to everything our turnout gear is exposed to. The best way we have right now is to use soap and water and just scrub them the best we can and spray them down with water. And I'm sure a lot of the manufacturers are starting to move to having all these parts that are material based being removable and washable in the gear extractor, so that can be cleaned. Everything else will be a solid surface that can be wiped down, and the carcinogens can be removed from that as well. The other two main things is gloves, and everybody knows this. Everybody hates washing their fire gloves. The chief said this yesterday, and he was in here and he knew that, is because everybody knows what happens when you wash your gloves. They shrink, they get stiff, they don't fit well, you know, they're hard to use then. They're just not the same as they were before. And trust me, they told the gear manufacturers at this meeting about things like that, because if that's preventing people from washing those are increasing our risk of getting exposures from those, okay? Helmets, we're pretty good about cleaning our helmets. Nobody ever removes the chin straps from our helmets, but if you think about that, that's also exposed to everything we go into a fire, because it sits right there on the outside of our outside of our face piece. And then when we're doing training, guess what? It's on our chin. We're sweating. We don't think anything about it, and we're just absorbing anything that's in that chin strap. They're a little bit of a pain to actually take off. It's usually 2 screws. You can throw them in a sink with some Dawn or in a bucket. Scrub them really good. Let them sit there for a little while, and that Dawn will pull a lot of that toxins out. You can buy replacements. They're only like $8 or $9, and you can have an extra ones if you want to like switch those out and make it easier on occasion and wash them. That's one big thing that people often don't think about. Ear flaps, pull those out of your helmet and throw it in when you're washing your gear. And then clean the inside of the suspension in your helmet, because believe it or not, there's a lot of particulate that builds up inside of there. Cultural changes. We do not do this anymore. And I don't know, and I think you guys probably will not be doing this anymore either, based on the conversation we had. We stopped doing this for a couple of reasons, and you know, first of all, the real reason we stopped doing this is the same reason I got home last night at 1 o'clock in the morning from Bowling Green, and my wife left me a note on the kitchen table and said, "Read Gabriel's note he brought home from school." So I wander over there and I look, and it says, "Someone in your child's class has had head lice." And I said, great. So they said, please check your child for the next 2 weeks or week and make sure. That's why we stopped, is because head lice was going around. And trust me, once you give one of the kids your helmet, every other kid in that class gets it. We don't want to spread that around. The other issue that came out while we stopped doing this is because Fire Prevention sent out a letter saying that most people who use, which we use, the traditional helmets, not the contemporary ones, we use traditional helmets. They weigh about 11 pounds. Kids' necks are not strong enough to hold those, and it can actually damage their necks. So they said it's not a good idea to do that. So we actually don't do this anymore based on that whole paradigm. However, what do we still do? We don't let the kids get in the fire trucks either, because again, the fire trucks inside are not necessarily completely clean. We don't want to expose those kids to it. They can still get on the outside of the trucks, check them out, and stuff like that. What else do? We still dress up in gear because we want them to see us in our turnout gear, what we look like, what we. I'm sure you want to be done for lunch, don't you? If we can stay, we can actually stay for lunch if you want. All right, good deal. So we're going to talk about where our risks are increased at, and kind of talk about when and how and things we can do, okay? And we'll just get into this a little bit, and I'll give you my opinion on what I think is the best bang for our buck to do mitigations, to address some of the issues and what are really crazy expensive and may only address a very small part of our exposures. So they actually were finally, we don't really know what goes on during live fires, carcinogens. The only thing we do know is that the toxin levels in live fire operations like hydrogen cyanide are 10 times the level of IDLH, 100 times our short-term exposure limit, hence why we wear, complete turnout gear, SCBAs during that process. They still haven't been able to measure the carcinogen levels at that point. They actually have devised a new method of doing that where they're pressurized containers that firefighters can take in there. All they have to do is hit a button. It actually sucks in some of the environment, and then they can take that out, give it to a scientist. They can take that back to a lab in a controlled environment and do the measurements that are necessary without the heat, without the danger, and all that stuff. So they're just air sampling for them, and it doesn't really take anything other than hitting a button because they're vacuum sealed. They basically will fill up until they hit atmospheric pressure, and then they'll close off. And then, it's just like a little canister, like a Ghostbuster little canister that you have all the stuff in there, and then they hand those off, and they can have those air samples that they're collecting. So that's something newer that they're working on to do. What we do know, our turnout gear, after we come out of a working fire, our turnout gear will off-gas for over an hour. Okay? When I say off-gassing, I mean all those carcinogens and toxins that are in the smoke inside of that fire, just on the actual attack on the fire, gets absorbed in our gear. And after we take our mask off and our hood off, in the old days I would sit in the truck and ride back to the firehouse, and I'm wearing my turnout gear still, all that off gas is occurring, and I'm breathing that straight into my system, okay? And we weren't aware of that. Off-gassing can last for an hour, can last longer. It also happens that off-gassing occurs with all the materials that were burned in the building as well. So the house itself off-gasses for hours after the fire's put out, almost to the point where everything gets back down to ambient temperature of whatever the temperature is that day. And then when you have somebody come along with a shovel and pick up some of that and move it around, you've just dispersed particulate back in the air again, and we're back in the same type of situation again. So be aware of those are kind of things that we face. We talked about some of the exposures, the dermal and mucosal exposure we face. You guys are lucky because I've talked about this lots. Your fire investigators are really good about wearing SCBAs and turnout gear. That is not the case across Kentucky and Jefferson County, city of Louisville. I often will catch fire investigators going in, and I say post-overhaul, let's be honest. We do very little overhaul, so we don't disturb evidence. We let the investigators get in there. And what are we doing? We're going in there with them with no turnout gear. We maybe have their bunker pants on and our helmet and gloves with a shovel, and we're helping dig through the stuff to find the root cause or origin of the fire. Okay, we should be wearing, if they're wearing full gear, we should be wearing full gear at that point. I know it's exhausting, it's the heat involved in it. In the winter it's great, in the summer it's horrible, and these in-between seasons it can still be pretty bad. But we've got to be cognizant of that type of thing is still occurring with that process. So, then we go back in and we actually then finish overhaul after the investigation is done and they made their, what if we have to do recoveries at the scene, if we have to make determinations based on what's going on, that's all that's done. We often are then called to the scene, called to come back and do overhaul. And I've heard stories as far as, getting called back the next day because there's a potentially missing other person in the fire and we haven't found them yet, so they want help searching for another body or something. Again, most likely what we would have always done in the past is we would have showed up with bunker pants, gloves, a helmet, and a shovel and just started sifting through stuff. We got to be more cognizant of that. Does that mean we have to go complete SCBA? That's up to command staff, but there are other things you can do to help protect yourself. You do want to try to limit as much exposure to your skin as possible because every one of those exposures is additive, meaning that over your life each one adds up and eventually you're going to get to a tipping point and you're going to have that potential chance of getting cancer. Fire station exhaust. This is one that a lot of people talk about. Fire trucks are diesel. Diesel exhaust is a carcinogen. Lots of talk about this. We do not have an exhaust capture system at all of our stations. We have an exhaust fan system at one. We don't have nothing at our headquarters. They are extremely expensive, somewhere in the neighborhood of about $500,000. Okay? And I like to preface that this is on my list of things that should be done. This set's pretty low. An easy solution to address this is what they talk about this is because our gear often sets in the same area as our trucks do. And when we start our trucks, that truck exhaust gets on our gear. Easy solutions for that without spending $500,000 on an air exhaust system that may or may not work well because it still depends on people to do certain things is to maybe build a room for your turnout gear. specifically, so that way it's separated from the apparatus bay. It also can have vent to the outside, so you have different ways to do that. So there's lots of different ways you can do that without having to spend your entire budget on cancer prevention on just exhaust systems, which might be just a very small part of our overall exposure. And I know some people, I think somebody yesterday was like so focused on that, and it's great to understand that that's one issue, but it's one issue out of 10 plus issues. If we can address 90% of those and leave that 110 and find some alternate ways to address it, that's great, versus if we just address that one small issue that may be 10%, we leave that 90% untouched. That's a lot more dangerous. So just be aware of that, and that's tough decisions for fire departments. We put in a grant every year to get an exhaust capture system for our firehouse, and we've been turned down every year by the state of Kentucky. This last year I wrote even a really nice section about how it can decrease the whole cancer portion of it. I wrote a whole portion about cancer thinking that might help. Still got kicked out, okay? It's one of those things. So just be aware of that. You will hear people talk about that. You will also see, I hate to say it, but there are companies that try to take advantage of knowing the higher cancer rates we face in the fire service, and they will come and try to push this as you need this because it's keep you from getting cancer. This is a part of a larger puzzle, and you have to kind of determine as a department how much it's actually playing in that entire, if it's playing a very small percent chance role, which I think overall it probably is, to spend the majority of your money on that probably doesn't make a lot of sense when you can spend your money on hoods, other things to do, other mitigations and things like that will really, second sets of gear, things that we'll talk about that are really important to have. I think that's kind of a key area for us to talk about and think about. I'm not saying this is important. If you had all the money in the world, absolutely, but you have to pick your battles and you have to pick where you can afford. And I know that because our department faces that on a yearly basis. We're making tough decisions. We actually decided not to replace some command cars this year so we could buy extra gear, even though the command cars, probably a couple of them could use some replacing, because we needed to buy extra sets of turnout gear for our paid firefighters so they could have 2 sets of turnout gear. And we'll talk about that later on, why that's a really important thing. Fire trucks. Decontaminating the interior of our fire trucks, something none of us ever do. Nobody ever even thinks about it. We ride, we go to the fire. I'm going to do an example because this is a comfy chair and I like to sit down. But we go to a fire, we make a working fire. Often in the winter time, the most common thing we do is we'll ride back. We still have our entire bunker gear on. We sit in that jump seat. We put the air pack back behind us. We ride back to the station, that jump seat, probably the window down a little bit to help us cool it down. Think nothing about it, get back to the station, we drop our gear. If our gear is filthy, we'll probably take it to the gear extractor and get washed, whatever. If it's the only set of gear and you have to work the rest of that shift, you're probably not going to do that till the end of your shift. And then later that evening, everybody decides, let's go out to eat. And what they say yesterday, White Castle, they were saying they were all going to go to White Castle. You want to go out to eat. So then you're wearing your station gear. You're getting in the truck, you throw your turnout gear in the truck, you get in the truck and you're sitting in that same seat where all those carcinogens were at, and now they're getting all over your station gear, okay? The second thing is then you just took in your gear that has been in a fire, been exposed to all that stuff, and you threw it back in the cab of the truck with you, and it's probably still off gassing, and we're all sitting there breathing that as we're driving back to have lunch, okay? So just things to think about. There are ways we can decon the inside of the fire trucks that don't cost money. It's a little bit of elbow grease and some time. There's not great protocols yet, but I can give you some ideas. And trust me, you guys are smart enough. When I say guys, I mean that non-gender specific, by the way. I use that as just a straight guys as guys. You guys are smart enough to know that what you need to do and what types of things you can do to decrease these exposures, okay? And that's just something that I think all firefighters across the spectrum are smart enough to know that. We face such types of things where we have to act quickly and problem solve quick enough that this is something that and most of the great things that I've come up with have been given to me from other firefighters who have said, hey, we could try that. And I thought, that's a fantastic idea. I have a firefighter who's a friend of mine, and she's had skin cancer. She's younger than me. I'm 43. She's in her mid-30s. and she's had skin cancer 4 times. She does not suntan. She's like, the worst thing I do is I got lots of tattoos. And I said, that has nothing to do with skin cancer. But she gets skin cancer because she's susceptible and she's getting it from the fire service. And so me and her talked, so one of the first things we discussed is she said, I think there's some new hoods out, and this is before they really got talking, and she was the one that brought me the first information about the particulate blocking hoods. And then so from that I gathered more information. She said, tell me which one I should buy, because she was wearing 2 hoods because she had such a consistency of getting skin cancer. Nobody in her family, just her. And it was one of those things, and she was concerned about, and she's the one that brought me the solution herself. So I mean, we see this a lot of times, that firefighters are great problem solvers when it comes to things like this. So particulate matter, when I say particulate matter, we cannot use a multi-gas meter, like I said, to consider that it's a safe environment to breathe in the fire service. When we're in a house, it just does not equate to that. The scariest thing I ever saw happen is when I was in this meeting in Phoenix, and this is from National Fallen Fire Foundation. It was the Occupational Cancer Alliance that we went to, and there's this huge truckie from New York that stood up, and he was a captain, and he said, so you're telling me for the last 15 years, when I've told my guys after I've checked my multi-gas meter that the air quality was good, that they could drop their air packs and their turnout gear, that they were safe, this entire time they've not been safe? And the doctor said, yeah. And he said, that's a heck of a thing for me to know 15 years after the fact. He said, because now we can't take back that 15 years worth of exposure. And the doctor's like, yeah. He's like, we can. He's like, the only thing we can do now is decrease your future exposures and try to help with the newer. And I mean, I understand his frustration, because we trusted that. That was one of the things we trust. And I understand that frustration. And I want to make this a point, is that for some of us, I have 10 years plus of exposure that I cannot change. Okay, I can reduce any future exposures I have, which are maybe the ones that are necessary for me to get cancer. So that might make all the difference for me getting cancer. The second thing is, for younger firefighters, we can actually probably try to prevent most of their exposures altogether. Okay, I mean, firefighting is dangerous in other ways. So if we can eliminate this portion of it and make that portion safer, it's still a dangerous job. We know that. We know firefighters die from everything from structural collapses to getting hit on scenes by motorists when we're making car accidents to everything else. It's a dangerous job, period. But if there's something that we can mitigate the chances of by just doing some different things, on the fire scene and as a culture, then we should address that. So think of it not just as you're helping yourself, but you're helping your brothers and sisters that are coming after you, because we'll get to a point where it won't be an epidemic in the fire service anymore. So talking about how we determine this stuff is bad. They took a large cohort of firefighters, men and women, 7 days after a fire, so a week after being exposed on a working fire. They collected urine samples from them. So 7 days after they had a working fire, they looked at in that urine to see what's in that urine. They found 4 times the amount of DNA damage causing agents in that urine. They found metabolites of those PAHs, those polycystic aromatic hydrocarbons. They found, which is basically breakdown products of that, 3 to 5 times the normal amount of that in their urine a week after they had been exposed to that fire. So that stuff's just then coming out of their blood and their kidneys and going out through their urinary tract. Okay. So this stuff stays in our body for a while, and everybody knows that, because I'll tell this story now. One shift I remember we made like we had an apartment fire and a house fire on a single shift that I worked. And you know how bad you smell after usually one good worker. That was two. One was it was an apartment fire. It was a concrete stairwell. Those get really hot. And it was cooking. It was a rescue. So we got in there really quick. We didn't have to worry about getting RIT set up or anything. So that was before RIT, actually, to be honest with you. It was in the 90s before we had all 2 in, 2 out. But we got in there quick. Me and another guy on a tack nozzle got in there looking for the victim. Couldn't find him. Searched and got back out. I got home that next morning, took a shower. I mowed the grass and did some other things that day. Took another shower. My wife and family got home. That night when I lay down to go to bed, my wife goes, did you take a shower today? And I said, yeah. She's like, man, you still smell so much like smoke. And you guys know that. You smell it on you for days, 2-3 days. And it's not uncommon, right? Because it's like leaching out of our bodies, okay? That's one of the things that I think we can address, and we can stop that. And these types of hoods will actually help a lot with that. I know City of Louisville has been using them, and you guys are going to get some. And from the feedback I've gotten on people that have used them, that almost goes away completely, which is a good sign, which means if it's not leaching out of your body, it's not getting in your body to begin with. So those are kind of some of the studies that we want to do with groups of firefighters. So who knows, I might come back and work with you guys in doing sampling after fires with you guys to see what levels you have after the fact, because you might be a good cohort to use to get that type of data. So what are the 3 major studies that kind of proved that this was an issue in the fire service, okay? So the first study that and you've got to look at the dates again, you can see it's after 9/11. All these studies were done post that. This first study is a meta-analysis, which is just a fancy word for ability to take a lot of smaller studies, put them through a computer, do a statistical analysis that's quantitative, does values, numbers, and say, is it possible, these 32 smaller studies put together, we looked at 20 different types of cancers, what's the 10 cancers that we see that have increased risk amongst all these studies, okay? Computer comes out with that, and you get a list of 10 cancers that have increased risk, and it tells you even the percentage risk, okay? So the number 1 was testicular cancer, myeloma, lymphoma, skin cancers, prostate cancer, melanoma, another form of skin cancer, brain cancer, rectal cancer, stomach cancer, and colon cancer, okay? So the first question I often get is that women are underrepresented in a lot of these studies. There's been more recent studies that have just taken place in the last couple of years dealing with departments that have large cohorts of female firefighters. And I think that's important because I will tell you in the state of Kentucky, the one great thing they did do is that our presumption law, they cover cervical cancer and breast cancer as a line of duty death for female firefighters. About 6 weeks ago, I believe it was, a report came out from San Francisco, which has a large cohort of female firefighters. They did a study looking somewhere between 6 to 9-fold increase among breast cancer among female firefighters in San Francisco compared to the general public, okay? So there are increased risks, but just because sometimes the numbers are skewed, we're just now getting that data, and they're really focusing. Sarah Janke is one of the people that I know personally who's really focused on women's health in the fire service and is looking specifically at those types of things because they are important and they need to be addressed. The problem is that some of this data is predominantly, you'll see this data took some smaller studies. A lot of the other data is predominantly data from 50-year periods, where, let's be honest, the majority of those early firefighters were all male in the 50s and the 60s, and then it wasn't until the 80s and forward till we started seeing more female firefighters. And so the numbers are somewhat askew there, but there is research going on right now to address that and get better numbers. I'm happy, like I said, that the state, at least the IAFF, pushed that they cover those 2 cancers because there is some data to support that. This newer study really does support that even further. I expect to just see more and more of that, and then once we have better ideas of that, we'll look at different ways. The benefit of this is no matter what the cancer is, male or female, the ways to prevent it are all the same. So the methods we're going to talk about mitigation are going to apply across the board, okay? Doesn't matter male, female, it doesn't matter. So, but I like to mention that because someone asked me last night. I taught 2 classes here last night, drove all the way to Bowling Green, taught a class, and then came back this morning. So somebody in Bowling Green asked me that because they have several female firefighters on their department, and they asked me the same question. And I said, that's a great question because it is an issue that they're facing right now. And I talked specifically to Dr. Janke about that, and she agreed that that's one of the things that she's really focused on. And we'll talk a little bit of some of the stuff she's doing right now here in a few minutes. So those are the initial 10 they listed. Then another study came out called the NIOSH study. The NIOSH study looked at 3 large cities, Chicago, San Francisco, and Philadelphia. Okay? We'll call an old city, a moderate old city, and a kind of new city, San Francisco. I only call Chicago a moderately old because of the Great Fire. Doesn't put it back to all the way to the beginning. What they did is they looked over a 59-year period. So for 59 years, from 1950 to 2009, which they consider this powerful in this study because it covers so many years. They found that the overall average increased risk of dying of cancer for a firefighter was 14%. So when most people saw that, I'm going to be honest, you know what they said? It's kind of what I would expect to be a firefighter. 14% increased chance of dying of cancer. I know that it's a dangerous job and it's a risk. As a scientist, I like to do what scientists do, and we like to really look a little bit further into the research. I don't know how true that 14% is, because that's an average based on from 1950 to 2009. That doesn't mean that in some years the amounts of cancer were higher than they were in other years, because it's all averaged together. So we don't know what like the rate for the last decade of cancer is in firefighters. That's the stuff they're working on right now, because people ask the same question I just asked, and a lot smarter than me, and ask it a lot sooner, and said, we need to know what's going on right now. This is great historically, and these are averages, but they don't really tell us what we're kind of facing right now, what type of percentage we're facing now. And as you'll see in this study right here, because it covers such a long period of time, look at the number one cancer they have listed up there, mesothelioma. Where do you get mesothelioma from? And I know everybody knows because they've stayed up late and watched TV. Asbestos, exactly. Probably the majority of firefighters in this room will have little to no asbestos exposure in their fire service career. We all wear air packs for most of the time with asbestos, especially if we do overhaul. The amount of buildings and facilities that have asbestos in it are significantly decreased because of the mitigation required to do any type of construction renovations in those buildings. So our exposure is pretty low. So a lot of this is probably from some of these earlier firefighters in the 50s and 60s and 70s where air pack use was not a thing. They just went in and ate the smoke, and that's the way it was. But they found rectal cancer, larynx cancer, esophageal cancer, intestine, kidney, lung. And then they also found an interesting thing. They found an increase in bladder cancer. And that was not restricted to just males, across the board. And among males, they found an increase in prostate cancer in firefighters less than 65 years of age. And it was actually in excess among firefighters between 45 and 59. And then this initial data kind of scared people, because they're like, well, we don't usually even test firefighters for prostate cancer to 50. So it was kind of one of the things that people were not too thrilled about. What's good about this study is that it does have a large amount of firefighters. I don't think that one of the strengths is the data that it was collected over such a long period of time, because I don't need to know what the rate of cancer was in the 50s necessarily. I want to know what the rate of cancer in the last decade or two is, because that gives me a better idea of what I'm addressing. And then the reason why I say that is because if we start seeing differences in rates, then we can basically judge if we're being effective in our mitigation from then forward. So that's why it's important to have more up-to-date numbers that we can use.
Is it only based on active firefighters? Retired?
So they did that basically, I think they did this when they pulled this information on both of these. I believe they pulled, I think on these two studies, because they're both, I think they only pulled active, because unless they were all union and they were able to pull the information from the unions as well. That's sometimes where the problem is that once you leave the department, it's hard to know what happens to certain people, if they get cancer or not. So it may be a combination of both. They might not have enough information for everybody. The unions are the best source of the information right now, because they're the ones that keep track of line of duty deaths, and they keep track of cancer deaths, and they've been keeping track of them for a while. I will tell you that some of the other ones, the studies do not look at after they leave the fire service what happens. It's just during the fire service, which makes it even more complex, because our state law in Kentucky says that at the age of 65, if I die of cancer after the age of 65, guess what? Tough luck. I'm on my own. Doesn't matter if I was a firefighter for 40 years, because I'm above age of 65, that's the cutoff. I could have retired, I could still be active firefighter and get my father-in-law, which I'll talk about in a minute, was a firefighter for 15 years. He's in his mid-60s now. Well, I'll say that because he just turned 70 this year, here next week. But I still call him his mid-60s because he'll be happy that I said that. Mid to late 60s, bladder cancer 1 year. His prostate numbers have been up and down throughout. It's a common thing you see with some people, that it's not a really great predictor of that. Last year he had prostate cancer. They had to do a prostatectomy and remove that. Luckily, completely healthy, back to work, back to life. He's in Africa right now on a missionary trip, so doing good. The problem with that is that, if he would have passed away, there's nothing that would have been helped. I mean, his insurance would have covered it, but there was nothing in the fire service would have covered it. His normal job, he was the assistant director of Latin American sales for Papa John's for years. He was a professor at U of L and McKendree. So he didn't have, his only exposure was, he didn't drink and smoke that well. He may drink a little bit of Cuba Libres on occasion, but didn't smoke or anything like that. So his exposure really was the fire service. He didn't have any other types of exposures. No history, no family history of that type of thing and things like that. So you just gotta kind of be aware of some of that stuff. And some of that data gets lost, especially with volunteers. We have no idea. Volunteers are the hardest bunch to talk about because they come and go and there's no tracking system for that. So we have no idea what the rate for volunteers is. If it's the same, if it's higher, if it's lower. It just makes it really complicated to track them. And some of these studies, like I said, they do include retired because the IAFF may have information. Other ones they may not. They may only include line of duty. And that can make it more complex too, because if you follow people all the way through life, that actual amount will increase. It definitely will, because as you get older, your chances of getting cancer will increase. So what they found in the next study was, let me hit that, sorry about that, is the last Asis Nordic study. It was done in 5 Nordic countries, again, over a 44-year period from 1960 to 2005. The way they did this study is they did 2 things. They used census data of who was a firefighter, okay? So they had all that census data. They knew who were firefighters, 16,000 firefighters and some odd. And they also had a national cancer registry that's been set up since the 50s in these countries. So that everybody that got cancer got put in a registry as early as the 50s, okay? So they were able to cross-reference their cancer registry with their census data to say, okay, every firefighter person that's been a firefighter, cross-reference them in our cancer registry and see if they develop cancer. And that's how they were able to look and see the numbers. So these numbers are based on that. It found a similar risk that the NIOSH study did. It found a couple of different cancers and different rates. Prostate cancer, again, was increased. This is the one that scared most of us the most, is that the highest risk of prostate cancer in male firefighters was in the age range of 30 to 49. 160% increase almost, okay? We do not even do prostate tests in firefighters below 50. I'm in that range. That scared me to death. I immediately went to the chief and said, we should do PSA tests from this year on all male firefighters below, I'd say starting at 40 at least, if not 30 to 35. I said, they already got the blood when they do our physicals. It's one extra little test they got to add in. It's nothing else they have to take from us, and it'd probably be a good idea, okay? Melanoma, non-melanoma skin cancer, again, we see lots of skin cancer. Mesothelioma, this one actually spells it out pretty simple. In firefighters over 70 years of age, so this one, like I said, because it's census data, it includes firefighters after they retire. And then you're hitting him because he's the old one over 70 years of age. That's not nice. But these are those earlier firefighters from the 60s and 70s that had the mesothelioma. It makes sense, okay? And then we saw some lung carcinomas, which are often hit or miss on some of these studies. So this people kind of agreed. Like I said, some scientists did what I just discussed about the 14% because some people are like, well, it's not that big of a deal. It's only a 14%. Now, be aware of what I just said. It's a 14% increased risk of dying, not getting cancer, and 14% increased risk of dying from cancer than the general population, okay? It doesn't tell you how much increased risk of getting cancer you have compared to the general population, just of dying, okay? But still in there's some wiggle room because of the way that it's an average, and I have more questions on that, and that's why they're doing some different studies, because I called them directly. No, I'm just teasing. Just because other smart people thought the same thing and said we need to have these types of numbers to go forward. This is kind of just a summary looking at the different ones that we cover. Colon cancer is not on here, but it is one of the ones that firefighters also face. And we'll talk about some of the things that we can do preemptively to decrease our our chances. So like right here, you can see colon cancer, testicular cancer is the highest. Myeloma, a lot of them basically took that initial 10 from that first, that Lemaster's meta-analysis and put those, and that was the basis for a lot of the stuff we'll see that was spread amongst the departments and among the media. This is from the Firefighter Cancer Support Network. These are the same numbers, they just converted them to times greater versus a percentage to make it a little bit more digestible. Again, very likely caused by chemicals emitted from regular household products when they burn, which we now know pretty much is the case. And they're not regular household products, they're synthetic household products basically. This was a nice little one that I got from, and we'll see a video about this. This came out of Palm Beach, Florida. The Sylvester Cancer Center there looked at, and they had ways of looking at the number of deaths starting from all the way in the 50s to 2014. The red is the amount of cancer deaths. There's often a lot of questions about this because the questions go around the two obvious questions is the reason we don't see a lot of cancer deaths up in here is because they weren't reported because they weren't considered related to the job. I don't know. I can tell you that some of them were reported, other ones weren't. I will tell you, if you look at this, our jobs as firefighters, our equipment and everything else has got a lot safer. We're making less fires than we did 50 years ago, but our number of fatalities have increased significantly over the last 50, 60 years. So there has been a change there. So if this is true and that we've got this steady rise since the 90s of increasing in cancer, and that holds true, the best that we can tell this all has to do with synthetics, because that's when we started seeing the rise in use of synthetics, because it made stuff cheaper, it allowed mass production, and people could buy types of things that often they couldn't afford before, because now they didn't have to be made of solid materials. They could have veneer and stuff like that on them. Cardiac. When I joined the fire service, I was told I would most likely die of a heart attack, because that's what people were dying from. That's changed. Looking at the line of duty deaths from the IAFF Memorial Wall since 2002, approximately 60% of those have been due to cancer. Boston, like we looked at earlier, has an even more serious issue.